Hello, we're finding these Jane's videos, and today I'm going to be doing a video that I've never done before, but it is a ranking of the Halloween Horror Nights, Universal Orlando Halloween Horror Nights 2021 houses. So this year is their 30 Years of Fear event. Jack is back, the icons are back. Unfortunately, Jack didn't get a show this year, but he is present in the event, and so are all the other icons, and it is a great year. Honestly, it might have become my favorite Horror Nights year to date. I've been going since 2015, and this year, up until this year, 2015 was always my favorite. But I think this year might have taken the cake because the houses are extraordinary. Unfortunately, the scare zones kind of lack this year, but the houses are absolutely extraordinary. And I want to rank all 10 of them because I've been twice this season, and I've been able to go in each and every house. And my favorites, I've been able to go in multiple times. So I'm excited to be ranking these, and hope you'll stick along for the ride. Like I said, there's 10. I'm going to be starting at my least favorite and going up to my favorite of the season. I wouldn't say there's really any bad ones this year. I think they're all pretty good. There's just some that are eh. But starting off at number 10 is actually one that I don't really care for. I wouldn't say it's bad. It's not horrible, but it's not one that I really care for. This one is Welcome to Scary Horror in the Heartland. Now, this one, it's just kind of all over the place, and I know what it's supposed to be. It's an homage to the lore of Halloween Horror Nights and a lot of their stories taking place in Cary, Ohio. So it's basically a lot of the stories and things that take place in Cary, Ohio put into a house, but it does not blend well at all. It really doesn't. I wish they would have made it seem like you're actually just going through a 1950s Ohio town, because that's what the sign suggests it would be. The facade is great. It's like a sign of like an old 1950s family, and it looks awesome. But then the house itself is just all over the place. You jump from scene to scene, and there's no correlation. And I understand most of the references in there, yet I don't even like it that much, so I could really understand that someone who does not know it at all is definitely going to be lost in this house. I think it's the weakest of the season and not one I really care for too much. Number 9 is one that's going to be controversial. It's Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House. Now, I will say, one of the only reasons this one's so low is because I've never seen a single episode of The Haunting of Hill House, so obviously it's not going to be too high on my list if I don't really know much about the property. However, I will say it was a very well done house. I love the facade. The facade is fantastic. I really like the set design and stuff in it. I think it looks great. There are some pretty scary parts, like there's a part where you go into a hallway that's completely black and you can't see anything. And I think it's a good house, but the only reason it's so low down is because I don't really know anything about The Haunting of Hill House that I can't appreciate it too much. So all the others just had to surpass it because I can't really appreciate the property. Number 8 is Universal Monsters, The Bride of Frankenstein Lives. I love the Universal Monsters, and back in 2019 they did a house all about the Universal Monsters, and I'm so glad that they're doing specific monster houses now. I hope they'll continue this trend. The Bride of Frankenstein has never been one of my favorite Universal Monsters. I think the Bride of Frankenstein movie is a great one, but the Bride herself has never been one of my favorites. However, I think the house was pretty well done. I don't really like the idea of her being the scientist in it because it's kind of just random how all of a sudden she learned how to talk and now she's a scientist. It's just kind of weird. However, I do like the house. I think there's some great sets. The Frankenstein's castle looks phenomenal in it. There's some great fog scents they use to really immerse you in the set. Some great actors in there and some great costuming and detail. Overall, one that I really like. Number 7 is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, I expected this one to actually be higher up on my list because the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of my favorite horror films of all time. And the house is good. Don't get me wrong, I really like the house, especially the facade. You walk into the gas station and it looks exactly accurate from the movie. In fact, most of the scenes look 100% accurate from the movie, as Universal usually does. However, my issue with it is that they threw in some scenes from the second movie, which I haven't seen in there, and it just kind of feels weird. Also, it doesn't really feel like you're going through the movie, even though the sets are from the movie. It doesn't really go plot by plot, and you don't really go through each scene as it progresses in the film. You kind of just go from place to place, so sometimes it's hard to really understand where you are or what scene in the movie this was taken from. However, I think it was a very well done house set design wise, and I think there were some great scares in there. Of course, it goes without saying there's a lot of chainsaws. Number 6 is Case Files Unearthed Legendary Truth. Now, one thing I want to mention is that I typically like the original houses more than the actual movie houses, simply because the movie houses aren't an original story, so you're not as surprised. You can't get as creative with them. However, I do like the movie houses a lot. I've always liked the original ones more, as I feel like that's a classic haunted house. Case Files is a great one. My first time going through it, I didn't like it as much, but then when I went through it again, and also when I thought back on it, it really went up on my list. I love the noir detective vibe to it. The only thing that brought it down for me in the first run through is that it's very hard to understand the plot and the story that's going on within the house, and it's a very story-driven house. But once I understood it, and basically you're supposed to be going through different novels of this detective, Boris Schuster, I think his name is, and he basically investigates the paranormal and monsters, and you're going through different detective novels, and it says the name of the novel before you go into that part of the house. So once I understood that and that clicked, I was like, okay, this makes a lot more sense, because otherwise it's just jumping scene to scene. It's kind of all over the place, but once you understand that, you definitely appreciate it more. However, the monster aspect, I love monsters, but I feel like that, if it didn't have monsters in it, it could have been a lot better. And you could be wondering how that's Halloween. Well, it could have just been a murder mystery house with some serial killer on the loose. I think that would have been cooler because I loved the noir vibe. However, the monsters kind of took away from that. But I still really, really liked this house. I think my favorite scene was the Kitty Cat Club, or really the alleyway before the Kitty Cat Club. That felt so noir. It felt just like an old detective film. You had the big neon sign, you had Boris Schuster in the alleyway smoking a cigarette, and you had like the 1920s girl talking to him, and he's talking, saying for some very detective-y type things. Great house. I really like that one. Number 5 is the Wicked Growth Realm of the Pumpkin. It goes without saying that I would like this one, however, I didn't like it as much as I expected to. I actually expected it to be at the very top of my list, or very close to the top, not halfway in. But it just didn't wow me as much as I thought. It is a really good house, but there's just others that took the cake above it, but it's still a really good one. I really like the scenery and set design in it. It's very classic Halloween with all the pumpkins everywhere. There's a witch, there's a Grim Reaper, there's a giant pumpkin lord at the end, there's pumpkin monsters, there's skeletons. It's all classic Halloween, very classic Halloween, and I really like that about it. There's nothing it really lacks, in my opinion. I don't think there's anything wrong with the house, just that others surpassed it for me. But I don't really think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's a very fantastic house. Number 4 is Beetlejuice. Now, I will say, I was a little upset with what they did with Beetlejuice, because though the sets are like spot on from the movie, again, kind of like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it just jumps from place to place and it's kind of hard to follow what's going on. I mean, I've seen Beetlejuice many times, I know what's going on, but I still wish it went more in order of how the movie goes. With that out of the way, it's a really good house. I don't get why they didn't use the actual audio from the movie. That kind of took away from the experience because it was like people doing very bad voice impressions of the characters. But other than that, the sets were great. The Beetlejuices looked great. Even if they didn't sound the best, they looked great. And really, the house itself looked like what you'd expect a Beetlejuice house to look like. And I think they pulled it off pretty well. Despite my 2 issues with it, I think they pulled it off pretty well. These next 3 are my top 3, and honestly, you're probably not going to hear any issues I have with these ones, because these ones are top tier, and they are ones that I absolutely adore, and I think alone, I mean, all these other houses were good too, and some great, but I think alone, these houses could have just made Halloween Horror Nights 30, and I would have been happy with it, even if it was just these 3, because they're just so incredible. Number 3 is Puppet Theater Captive Audience, which I expected it to be my favorite. However, it wasn't, but that doesn't mean there's any faults on the house itself. It just means I like the other 2 that are above it more. But this is a fantastic one. I'm really about that theming, the creepy marionettes and puppets, because I'm really into theater and theatrics and stuff, and that's exactly what this house had. I think it's probably one of the creepiest haunted houses I've ever been in. I don't get scared in haunted houses personally, but I think creep factor, this was one of the creepiest ones I have ever been in, and I really liked it. There was one scene that I thought was really disturbing where there were shadows or silhouettes of puppets dancing on the wall, and they were so creepy looking. And there's also a scene of a guy wearing a mask basically turning someone into a puppet, and he stutters a little bit when he talks, and I think it adds a little extra hint of insanity there. And he's great. I really liked him. I thought he was a cool character. The sets in this were great. I think one of my favorite parts is the guy underneath the stage. You go under the stage, and he's under there reciting Shakespeare before he goes on the stage. And if you look above him, you can see the curtains. Because he's under the trapdoor, you can see the curtains, so it shows that he's under the stage in the trapdoor, and I thought that was really cool. There's also a scene where there's a whole stage with chairs and stuff. It's really impressive. I think one of my favorite parts, though, is the ending hallway, because there's actual dancing marionette animatronics in there, and I think those are extremely creepy, and I like them a lot. There's also some great music in this house, and great audio alone. Really a fantastic one. Not to mention, the facade is incredible. Number 2 is one that I cannot stop raving about. I've gone in it multiple times. Each time I went in it more than once. Actually, I think I only went in it once the second time, but the first time I went in it more than once, because it's just so incredible in literally every way. This is Revenge of the Tooth Fairy. It's one of the most brilliant haunted houses I have ever been in, and I think it is the creepiest haunted house I've ever been in. The name says it all, Revenge of the Tooth Fairy. You go into this giant storybook facade, which looks incredible, and you go through this Victorian-era home where tooth fairies have taken over. And I don't think the tooth fairies themselves are creepy. I think they're really cool, but I don't think that's the creepy part of the house. I think the very dark nature of the house is really what makes it creepy. The music is great. There's a narrator talking in a very creepy voice over it, all explaining the story because you're supposed to be within a storybook. It doesn't look like a storybook after you go through the facade, but you're basically supposed to be in a storybook. And there's still writing on the walls of the story as you're going through, which I think is cool. But it's just so dark. The tooth fairies are literally killing everyone in the house and ripping out their teeth. And I think one of the darkest things are the props. The props of the corpses are some of the most realistic I've ever seen, and they're creepy. There's one that is a grandpa sitting next to the fireplace, which the fireplace has a super cool effect, may I add, and his jaw's ripped off. I think the creepiest one is the grandma who's sitting in a chair, leaning on a table, and you just see her head face down on the table, and the back of her head has just this giant gaping hole in it. I think it's horrifying. It really is one of the most horrifying haunted houses I've ever been in. It's phenomenal. In the kitchen scene, the bells are like ringing on their own. It's just great. I'm getting chills just talking about it because I love it to death. It's one of the greatest haunted houses I think I've ever been in. Number 1 is Halloween Horror Nights Icons Captured. Now, the only reason this is number 1, I'm going to say it, is because I'm biased towards the icons. I love the icons. They're the reasons I make horror films. They inspired a lot of my characters, and so I love them to death. And so it's going to be my favorite house. It's not a scary house. It's not a creepy house. It's just a really cool house. You go in and they have this really cool, kind of metalish, kind of dubstep metal type music playing. I don't know. It's very high energy. And you go in and you see all the icons, and then you go through each icon's room. Lady Luck has a room, which I think is pretty well done. You go through the storyteller's room, which is pretty cool. You go through the director's room, which I think is one of my favorites, because you go see his like snuff films and stuff. The usher has a room where I think that's actually a really cool one, because they pump the scent of popcorn into that one, and it's basically in the movie theater. And you do see all the icons in each of their rooms, may I add. The caretaker has a room, which I think is one of the coolest, and one of my favorite parts about it is that they have a caretaker actor behind a stained glass window, and you can basically see his shadow as you're walking by it. Also, there's a part in that room where there's a coffin and there's a guy banging on the coffin and screaming to get out. It's not a real guy, it's a prop, but I think it's really, really cool. Um, and then the Bloody Mary has a room, which is one of the scariest because there's screaming and then all the panels drop. And when the panels drop, it makes a very loud banging sound. And there's basically bloody faces behind the mirrors. And Jack and Chance have a room, which, if you don't know me, I love Jack and Chance. It's basically Shady Brook Asylum. And unfortunately, I don't think their room is one of the best, but I'm glad to see Jack and Chance in it. And then at the very end, there's a throne, and the superior icon sits on the throne. Each time you go through, it's going to be a different experience. I've seen Lady Luck on the throne. I've seen Jack on the throne. I've seen the Usher on the throne. I don't know if I've seen any others on the throne, because I think I saw Jack on the throne twice, I'm pretty sure. But one thing I really love about this house, not only the icons in it are great, but the actors in this house are more interactive than any actors in any of the other houses. And the fact that Halloween Horror Nights is an event that has pre-recorded audio that the actors basically just jump out and the audio plays and they kind of just move and lip sync to it, it doesn't give them as much possibility to actually interact with guests. However, in this house, they're just great at it. I gave Chance a heart, and she got all happy and like smiled. I was applauding Jack when he was on the throne, and he was asking for more applause and like hyping everyone up. They're just really good at interacting with you in that house, and the cast in that house, I think, is the best cast out of all the houses this year. I think they do a phenomenal job, and they really embody the characters of the icons. Obviously, the people who are in the houses portraying the icons aren't the ones who usually portray them in the commercials and the stage shows and all of that stuff, because those people don't actually do the haunt scaring. They're usually like, Jack is there. The actual Jack is at the event this year, but he travels around and like walks in the streets and stuff because he actually does acting instead of scaring. And so they have someone else portraying Jack in the house, but my point is that the cast in the house that portrays the characters, and they typically aren't the actual people who play them, do a phenomenal job at acting just like the people who play them, and it's great. And that is why it is my favorite house of the season. Like I said, Halloween Horror Nights is absolutely phenomenal this season, and unfortunately I don't think I'll be able to go back before Halloween, but dang, is it a great event. And if you can make it out there within this last week of October, I highly suggest it, because this is definitely one of their best seasons, if not their best in my opinion. I hope you all enjoyed. If you've been to Halloween Horror Nights, or if you've seen the videos of the event from this year, let me know your favorite houses in the comments below. Keep howling at the moon, my werewolves.